Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into one of those legends that people whisper about but rarely stop to measure against reality, the mysterious kingdom of Shambhala. Imagine a place tucked so deep in the Himalayas that not even satellites or trekking maps can betray its gates. Snowstorms swirl like curtains, mountains fold into each other like origami, and somewhere inside that maze lies a city that is supposed to be eternal, golden, and invisible to most eyes. You probably won't survive this climb in real life, unless you're half mountain goat and half monk, so it's a good thing we're just using imagination here. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, I'd love it if you commented with your location and the time where you are, so we can see just how wide our little bedtime community has spread. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk along a narrow ridge, the sky painted deep indigo, stars glinting above like silver grains. The wind carries whispers you almost mistake for human voices. Each gust feels like a reminder. People have searched these mountains for centuries, lured by the tale of Shambhala. Some called it a paradise of peace, others a fortress of hidden power. The mainstream fact is simple. The legend of Shambhala is firmly rooted in Tibetan Buddhist texts, most prominently the Kalachakra Tantra, which describes it as a real kingdom where wisdom and compassion rule. The air grows thinner with every step, and you pause to catch your breath. Your boots crunch on frozen gravel, and you picture the generations of seekers who trudged here before. The quirky tidbit is that in the 1920s, a Russian artist and explorer, Nicholas Roerich, claimed he saw visions of Shambhala's towers shimmering on the horizon. Some say he was dehydrated, others say inspired. Either way, no one pulled out a smartphone to fact-check. You step past a row of prayer flags snapping in the icy air, their colors faded, but their intent sharp. Each flutter meant to spread compassion across the winds. You brush one with your glove and feel a strange sense of connection. Historians still argue whether Shambhala was meant to be a real geographic place or just a symbolic inner landscape that monks used to explain enlightenment. The debate lingers like mist around the peaks. The night is quiet, except for your own steps and the occasional creak of the earth settling under cold. You chuckle to yourself. If Shambhala really exists, it better have good central heating. Otherwise, enlightenment is going to need a lot of extra blankets. Somewhere far below, villages dot the valley with faint lanterns, ordinary life pulsing against extraordinary legends. It makes you think, even in places where people live tough, day-to-day lives, myths still rise like smoke into the stars. You imagine a yak herder telling stories to his children, pointing to the snowy ridges and saying, "Beyond there lies a kingdom of light." And the kids, probably shivering under wool blankets, nod wide-eyed, while secretly hoping the kingdom also has hot tea. You walk further, the wind howling now like a restless spirit. The mountains feel alive, as if they're eavesdropping on your thoughts. For a moment, you almost expect a golden city to flicker into view, hovering just beyond reach. Then, the clouds close in, and all you see is the pale shimmer of snow. Still, the legend holds steady. It tells of a hidden land untouched by war, where rulers govern with wisdom, where disease and aging are banished, and where, according to prophecy, armies will someday march out to defend the world in its darkest hour. It's both comforting and unsettling, like realizing your guardian angel moonlights as a warrior. As you stand at the ridge's edge, you notice how silence itself feels thick, as though waiting for you to step further. Somewhere deep inside, you sense that this is just the beginning of the journey. You grin faintly, because whether Shambhala is real or not, at least the hike counts as cardio. The ridge narrows until you have to press sideways against the rock, inching along while the abyss yawns below. Frost gathers in your beard, or would if you had one, and the wind shoves at your shoulders like an impatient guide. Somewhere in this labyrinth of peaks, tradition claims, lie the gates of Shambhala, hidden behind snow and stone, visible only to those destined to enter. Your boots scrape, and you wonder how many seekers have stood here before you, imagining that each shadow might be a doorway. A mainstream fact grounds you in reality. Tibetan lore often places Shambhala beyond the snowy mountains of the Himalayas, described as a perfectly ordered kingdom where enlightenment rules. It's not just folklore either. For devout practitioners, Shambhala represents a real place, with a specific geography that has been described in detail, palaces aligned like mandalas, rivers flowing with clarity, and gates guarded by mountains themselves. Your hands grow numb, and you cup them together for warmth. As you do, you notice faint markings carved into the rock, perhaps the work of pilgrims passing through. Symbols of lotuses and circles, maybe attempts at protection, or simply doodles from bored travelers. The quirky tidbit whispers through your mind. Some early explorers claimed that the entrance to Shambhala was guarded by invisible beings, creatures of air and fire who would turn away unworthy seekers. One writer even joked that these guardians were just locals with good camouflage and strong opinions about trespassers. The snow begins to fall, soft at first, then heavier, until it blinds the horizon. You squint and laugh quietly. Of course, the weather would decide to be dramatic just as you near the fabled gates. Historians still argue whether descriptions of Shambhala's gates were metaphorical, representing meditation thresholds, or if they referred to actual passes like this one, where geography itself formed barriers that only the most determined could cross. You push forward, boots sinking ankle-deep in drifts. Each breath stings your throat. Somewhere in the whiteout, you think you see a dark shape, like an arch. But when you blink, it's gone, only snow swirling where the outline had shimmered. It makes you wonder, is Shambhala less about what you see and more about what you're ready to believe? A sudden gust tears your hood back, and you mutter a complaint into the storm. If the kingdom really is up here, they could at least invest in a welcome mat. Instead, you get frostbite and a nose that feels like it's about to fall off. Enlightenment, it seems, comes bundled with hypothermia. The path climbs steeply, jagged stones poking through snow like broken teeth. You lean heavily on your staff, imagining monks trudging the same slope centuries ago, their robes stiff with ice. Did they whisper prayers for strength, or did they grumble under their breath like you're doing now? Maybe both. When you pause to rest, you realize how silent the world has become. No birds, no streams, just the rasp of your breath and the hiss of snow. It feels like a stage has been cleared, waiting for something to step out of the curtain of white. You almost expect a golden gate to emerge, carved with dragons and lotuses. Instead, a mountain goat stares at you, chewing in slow judgment. You sigh. Not quite the guardian you imagined. The snow tapers, and moonlight slips through gaps in the clouds. The world glows silver, and for a heartbeat, the peaks look like towers. You hold your breath, half convinced you're staring at Shambhala's outer walls. But the clouds close again, and the illusion fades. Still, the journey feels charged with something larger than weather. Whether gates of stone or thresholds of mind, you sense you are crossing into a deeper layer of story, where the line between the physical and the mythical blurs. And in that moment, the path ahead feels less like a climb and more like a test. The snowstorm eases into a hush, leaving the mountains glittering under a bruised sky. You find yourself standing on a plateau, flat as though carved deliberately, the ground marked with faint lines that spiral outward. At first, you think they are cracks in the ice, but as you step closer, you recognize the shapes, intricate circles and squares forming the outline of a mandala. The so-called map of Shambhala is not written in ink but in geometry itself. A mainstream fact settles in your mind. Tibetan texts describe Shambhala as laid out like a perfect mandala, palaces, gardens, and monasteries radiating outward from a central palace of the king. Each ring represents harmony between body, speech, and mind. The description is so detailed that some scholars compared it to blueprints, as though monks were trying to draft the kingdom for future builders. You kneel to trace the icy grooves with your finger, half expecting them to pulse with light like a fantasy movie prop. Instead, your glove just picks up frost. Still, the design feels alive. And here comes the quirky tidbit. In the 19th century, some Western explorers swore that monks gave them secret maps to Shambhala. Most of those maps turned out to be mandalas, diagrams of the universe, not actual road charts. Imagine hiking with a compass only to discover your guide handed you abstract art. You chuckle, because if this really is a map, you'll need better GPS reception. Historians still argue whether these mandalas were symbolic tools for meditation or encoded directions toward a real location hidden in the valleys of Tibet. Some believe both are true, that the geography of the land itself mirrors the mandala's shape, as if mountains and rivers conspired with monks to hide a kingdom. You walk the outer circle, boots crunching in steady rhythm. Each step feels deliberate, as though the earth is testing your patience. The silence makes your thoughts louder. Maybe Shambhala isn't guarded by soldiers or stone walls, but by the sheer confusion of interpreting symbols. After all, nothing deters an impatient traveler more than math disguised as art. The clouds part, revealing a thin ribbon of sunlight spilling across the lines. Suddenly, the grooves shimmer, and the mandala glows faintly in gold. Your breath catches. Is it reflection or revelation? You lean closer, but the glow fades, leaving you squinting like someone who just stared at a flashlight. Great. Enlightenment, but with temporary blindness. You straighten and gaze across the plateau. Beyond the lines, the mountains rise like jagged guardians. Somewhere in those ridges perhaps the pattern continues, hidden in valleys, rivers, and passes. It makes you laugh softly. If the monks really did hide directions in plain sight, they must have been the ultimate pranksters. Find Shambhala, they whisper, but only if you can solve our cosmic crossword. The cold creeps into your bones, but you keep circling, following the rings until you reach the center. There, a single stone stands upright, carved with symbols nearly erased by centuries of wind. You rest your hand against it, half hoping for a door to slide open. Instead, nothing happens, except your glove freezes to the stone for an embarrassing second. You peel it away with a muttered complaint, so much for secret portals. Yet the presence of the mandala lingers. It tells you something important. Shambhala might not just be a place to stumble upon, it might be a design to live by, a pattern that exists wherever balance is found. And even if the map never leads to a golden city, it still pulls you deeper into the mystery like a compass that points not north but inward. You linger at the center stone, then follow the flags into a lee of rock where the air holds still. A squat doorway waits under a drift. You duck inside and meet warmth, butter lamps, and the dry scent of juniper. An old caretaker sets a clay kettle on a brazier and waves you to a low bench as if hikers step out of storms every hour. Your hands cup a bowl of tea that tastes faintly of smoke and a pharmacy aisle. You swallow anyway. Altitude makes everything gourmet. He begins without ceremony. The kingdom you seek, he says, moves through time by a different beat. Its rulers are called Rigdons, keepers of the wheel. Some reign for lifetimes that read like mountain ranges. You listen while the lamps tick and the snow hushes the doorway. A mainstream fact frames his tale. Tibetan Buddhist Kalachakra sources list 32 kings of Shambhala, beginning with King Suchandra and ending with a future monarch known as Rigdon Drakpo, or Rudra Chakran, who appears in an age of disorder to restore balance. The texts give names, order, virtues, and even palace descriptions with the confidence of a chronicle. The caretaker sketches an invisible diagram on the floor with one finger. He speaks of early kings who sheltered the Kalachakra, teaching the way a traveler shields a flame. They ruled by rhythm more than by decree. Calendars, alignments, breath, and festival cycles acted as law. You picture a palace laid out like the mandala on the plateau, every gate and corridor tuned to pull attention toward the center. Policy by architecture. You ask what a day looked like. He smiles. Mornings began with listening to air, river, and market. Then decisions, brief and spare. Then study, practice, and time with the people. He says, a ruler who steadies breath can steady a province. You nod. Your fitness tracker has been saying that for months. A fringe curiosity slips in with the kettle's steam. Certain esoteric writers outside these mountains claim the Rigdon line persists through longevity elixirs or communicates by mind with hidden teachers to guide events beyond the Himalayas. You treat it the way you treat ads for miracle batteries. Interesting, unproven, possibly a projection of hope. He names a few kings by epithet: gentle lotus for the patient one, thunder lion for the brave one, clear mirror for the ruler who favored reflection before action. In those stories, enemies fade not through punishment but through a change of tempo. Slow the drum, slow the anger. Field commanders hate this advice until it works. You grin despite yourself. Historians still argue whether the role of 32 kings is literal dynastic history, a symbolic ladder of inner development mapped onto meditation stages, or a political myth designed to fortify border communities. The caretaker lets the three options sit like stones in a small cairn. The lamp's steady. He tells you the Rigdons were said to keep libraries that indexed more than books. They tracked seasonal scents, the first insect buzz in spring, the tone of bells in thin winter air. Government by attention. Minutes might include cloud shape and sparrow count. You ask how they handled budgets. Carefully, he says, even in paradise someone tallies yak. Portraits come up next. He chuckles that artists paint kings who look suspiciously like the artist's own teachers. Brows change with fashions. Halos grow or shrink with the pigment budget. One scroll nearby seems to have given a Rigdon the nose of the abbot. Occupational hazard. He returns to the promise that closes the list. When confusion grows thick and noise drowns the simplest kindness, the final king rides out to reset cadence, not a conqueror in the old mold, more a conductor correcting tempo, flags lower, marches ease, speech cools, valleys remember how to breathe together. You ask how the kings lasted so long. He says, the line persists by continuity of stance, not one immortal person but a posture inherited and refined. A flame passed from lamp to lamp until the room forgets which flame was first. You look at the bracketed lamps. The light does not care which wick it uses. Your tea cools. He refills it and adds a pinch of something that tastes like bark and stubbornness. You picture a ruler signing a decree, then sitting in silence long enough to hear whether the decree lands softly or lands like a falling pan. Quality assurance by quiet. You wish more boardrooms tried it. He admits that the line blurs around the edges. There are gaps in the record. In those spaces, new tales grow. Kings step into markets in plain clothes and pay with coins no mint recognizes. One favorite story says a Rigdon once bought noodles on a windy pass and left metal stamped with a star from no known realm. The vendor kept it as luck and lived a long, easy life. Causation untested, noodles excellent. You ask whether the Rigdons ever argued. He grins. Of course. The wheel turns through friction, but disputes resolved to rhythm faster than to victory. Two views circled until they clicked like gears. He taps the kettle twice. The sound lands like a small treaty. He gestures toward the doorway. Outside, the plateau waits under a glaze of moonlight. He says a palace aligned to stars begins with one step in time. You consider your record with rhythm and wince. He shrugs. Start with breathing, he says. Not every king wears a crown. The brazier pops. The room smells like butter and stone. You ask if any rulers ran from duty. He says some vanished for seasons to practice and returned with a steadier hand. You recognize the pattern from your life, where the best decisions arrive after a walk you did not schedule. Before you leave, he points at the space between two lamps. The list of kings always includes what is missing, he says. Space to change course. Space to let a better idea arrive. A ruler who cannot leave a pause is a drummer who cannot find the downbeat. You finish your tea and set the bowl down like a little vow. You bow. He waves it away and thanks the weather for delivering you. Outside, the air is calmed. The mandala glints with frost and stardust. Somewhere, perhaps, a Rigdon reads the same sky and adjusts a kingdom by a fraction of a breath. You do not need proof. You step more slowly, as if each footfall signs a quiet agreement with the night. You follow the starlit crust across the plateau until a ribbon of warm light pools against the rock face. It isn't moonshine. It wavers with breath. A cleft opens into a walled court where the wind dies and darkness folds neatly. In niches along the stone, butter lamps, hundreds of them, hold steady like a small constellation brought indoors. Monks move through the glow with cups and tongs, heads bowed, steps exact. Guardians, not of treasure, but of a fire that insists on staying alive. One bows and beckons you closer. Heat rolls out after the open cold. The flames speak in a tiny language of wick and air. The monk dips a ladle into a pot of pale gold. The smell is sweet and grassy and unabashedly dairy. Yak butter does not whisper. You suppress a smile. If a skincare brand bottled this, the slogan would be truthful but short-lived. A mainstream fact steadies the scene. In Tibetan Buddhism, butter lamps, mar mi, are a central offering that symbolizes wisdom, dispelling the darkness of ignorance. Major temples such as the Jokang in Lhasa maintain vast halls of lamps. Pilgrims bring butter as an offering of merit, and monks tend the flames from before dawn until late at night. The practice is common across the plateau, where devotion translates into measured, practical work. The monk twists a cotton wick, sets it on a brass lip, and lights it with another flame. His hands are calm, precise, economical. He shows you how to trim a wick with a pinch, how to tilt the cup so new fuel merges with old without drowning the fire. Your first attempt produces more smoke than light. He nods patiently. You try again, and it takes. Somewhere, your inner smoke detector clears its throat. He explains the schedule. Teams rotate by bells, night keepers patrol for drafts, shift cups, rescue sputtering wicks. Each lamp has a memory. Too much fuel and it drowns, too little and it trembles. The choreography is part chemistry, part prayer. You think of server rooms and rows of green status lights, different language, same obsession, uptime. A fringe curiosity rides the warmth. Travelers' tales speak of an ever-burning flame in hidden shrines, said to have persisted for centuries without refueling. Skeptics roll their eyes, romantics raise their cups. In nearby regions, natural gas seeps feed small temple fires. Jwala Ji in the Himalayan foothills is a famous example, so legends gain plausible roots. Whether such stories here reflect geology, endurance, or wishful thinking, no one has produced a maintenance log. He hands you a brass spoon engraved with a cloud. You feed 3 lamps, then 4, thinking only of the small glowing mouths before you. The hall hums with syllables as a low mantra turns the night into warm cloth. Light stains the stone gold. Your fingers glisten. Congratulations, you now wear the world's least marketable hand lotion. Historians still argue whether references to eternal lamps in Himalayan and Central Asian travelogues describe physical flames guarded around the clock, poetic images for uninterrupted lineage, or motifs borrowed from neighboring traditions. The debate curls like smoke, visible, fragrant, and always drifting toward the nearest open window. The monk points to a mural. A wheel, 12 gates, and a shining tower sit at the center. He names no places. He only says a city stays alive the same way a flame does, protected from sudden wind, fed carefully, watched by many eyes and not just one. The hint is obvious. Power that tries to be a bonfire burns out. Power that learns to be a lamp survives weather. Another mainstream detail threads in. Ritual texts instruct practitioners to offer lamps during Kalachakra ceremonies tied to the Shambhala prophecy, emphasizing clarity and interdependence. The offering is not pyrotechnics, it is attention. Keeping a flame exact becomes practice in keeping perception steady. Scholars note the linkage across commentaries without controversy. You carry a tray into a side cell where a single lamp faces a polished stone. The monk taps the lintel. This is for travelers and for the lost, he says, a flame that accepts every name. He trims the wick, the glow doubles in the stone. 2 candles from one source. The optics are simple, the message is patient. He laughs and shows a ledger. Donations of butter are noted with tidy numbers and thanks. This is not mystery. This is supply chain. A lamp, he says, is a good teacher because it responds honestly. Feed it poorly and it fails. Feed it well and it brightens. You picture meetings shortened if agendas were rows of flames. Which items flicker, which burn clean, which smoke everyone out. He pours the last of the ladle into a cup near the door. Light doesn't travel alone, he says. It carries heat and air and human hands. Translation: nothing sacred floats untethered. Your toes agree. You edge closer and pretend it's philosophy, not survival. You ask carefully whether anyone guards a flame said to belong to Shambhala itself. He shrugs, a gesture made of winters. A kingdom that moves in rhythm does not brand its lamps, he says, but some fires carry stories that walk faster than the wind. You appreciate the dodge, elegant and also good policy. The hours thin. Your eyes adapt until the hall glows like a map of stars. The work feels less like tending objects and more like keeping company with something alive. Not dramatic, just constant. The monk nods toward the doorway, meaning the night is steady enough to hold itself. He returns your spoon and presses a wick into your palm. It is a soft, unheroic souvenir. You're relieved. Heroic souvenirs usually require insurance. You step into the courtyard. Wind has slowed to a careful breath along the eaves. Above, the real stars concede that the lamps are holding their own for style points. You tuck the wick into a pocket as if it might catch a stray spark and start a tiny revolution. The path back to the plateau lies dark and clear. You follow it, warmed by heat that is not only fuel. Behind you, the guardians keep moving, faces calm, motions exact. The flames do what flames always do: consume, illuminate, and teach focus politely but relentlessly. You do what travelers do. Watch, learn what you can, and move on before you mistake someone else's devotion for your destination. Snow squeaks underfoot. Ahead, the night leans toward pages and shelves, libraries perhaps. Fire has passed its lesson to light on paper. You follow the warmth from the lamp hall into a corridor that smells of juniper and dust. The air grows still, soft and faintly sweet, like paper after rain. A monk with a cord of keys raises one finger, the universal library dialect for quiet. He turns a lock and a lattice door size open. Inside, long folios, pecha, rest on painted racks, each stack bound between carved boards and belted with cloth the color of faded marigolds. Butter lamplight lays a quiet gold across the bindings, and the room begins to breathe at a slower tempo. He guides you to a low table polished by centuries of elbows. Wrappers sigh as he unties them. Hand-laid pages appear, fibers faintly wavy, edges squared by patience. Lines of disciplined script run clean and steady. A tiny lotus in one margin has outlived more winters than some dynasties. You touch the folio with two respectful fingers. The page answers with a dry, papery breath. A mainstream fact steadies the hush. In 1900, caretakers at the Mogao Grottoes near Dunhuang opened a sealed chamber now called the Library Cave, revealing tens of thousands of manuscripts and paintings from roughly the 4th to the 11th centuries. That discovery reshaped scholarship on Buddhism and Silk Road history, proof that hidden rooms can argue with time and sometimes win. The monk lays out a tray of block-printed leaves, the ink satiny and sure. Faint guide marks show printers where to place the next sheet, and a worm track curves across one corner like a scratched melody. Even the insects, you decide, are literate up here. The room hums with soft labor. Two novices collate in a counting whisper. Another grinds soot with water into a calm black that drinks the lamp glow. An elder paints a missing character with a hand so steady you suspect the bone itself meditates. Somewhere a kettle clicks. Even the steam behaves. A quirky tidbit drifts in with the smell of ink. Travelers claim that special manuscripts were written with powders of ground gems or even meteorite dust, and that under butter lamplight, the letters give off a faint inner glimmer. Romantic, unproven, and probably terrible for the quill, but your eyes keep catching glints anyway. The monk notices and rotates the page so the mica flecks stop flirting with your skepticism. You ask how the place is organized. He opens a narrow drawer of wooden slips, title tags in careful script, and a ledger old enough to have opinions. Some texts migrate seasonally, following humidity like birds. If you doubt librarians or meteorologists, note the barometer wedged between incense and bookmarks. Overdue fees, he says without smiling, are payable in butter. You audit your conscience and estimate 3 yak years. He unfolds a star chart, dots linked with hair-thin gold lines. Some charts anchor meditation, some seed and harvest, and some anchor stories you do not timetable. A tiny marginal hand points at a cluster and writes only, "Road." Road to what? The room shrugs in polite silence. Another folio looks like the plateau mandala turned inside out, rings of names and small instructions on where to place breath. He taps the center. The table gives a hollow knock as if to say, "Yes, here too." Knowledge prefers circles to fences. You file that away next to "Bring warmer socks." He pours tea that tastes like roasted bark making an effort and tells you about repair days when the whole community becomes a clinic for paper, paste from wheat, Kozo threads, the softest brushes they own. Spines relearn their purpose, margins behave. You propose a festival called Spine Alignment, where everyone mends a book in their posture. He allows the shadow of a smile, which up here counts as a standing ovation. Historians still argue whether the sealing of certain caches, Dunhuang chief among them, was driven by threat and hurried protection, by ritual closure of a scriptorium, or by a practical consolidation that accidentally became a time capsule. The debate turns like a slow fan, moving the air without forcing it. In this room, the answer feels simpler. Endurance has good librarians. He unwraps a darker page painted with gold ink. The words look newly minted. Ceremonial copies of key teachings, he says, were written in precious inks to honor their contents, not to impress anyone. You weigh minimalism versus maximalism and decide the page wins either way. A novice passes with a tray of empty cups and the gravity of a diplomat. You stand aside. Nobody wants to be the headline, "Traveler collides with tea." Shelves lead to a lower room where the ceiling presses the day out of you. Here the boards carry titles in red. These are commentaries that walked from India on the backs of memory and put on new shoes in Tibetan. You briefly imagine a Dewey Decimal System in Sanskrit in black out at the thought of the card catalog. When you recover, you admit the idea is elegant. Ideas migrate, change language, and then help you do the dishes of your century. He stops before a rack wrapped in plain cloth. The tags are blank. Training texts, he says, mundane words, ordinary scenes, because wisdom collapses if it can't carry groceries. A line about stirring porridge without splashing anger into it makes you nod so hard the lamp flame bows back. Domestic enlightenment seems undermarketed. He speaks softly about treasure traditions, tales of teachings hidden in caves, statues, or walls to be discovered later by those with the right eyes. Within the culture, it is taken seriously. Outside, it reads like myth. He shrugs as if to say, "Let time decide what becomes treasure." Dust lifts from the table like quiet applause. You decide the cleaning staff deserves a parade. At the far end, a chest sits with its lid cracked like a tired smile. Inside are scrolls mapping trade routes, river names, medicinal plants, and taxes paid in wool. It is gloriously unromantic. Civilizations run on receipts. You stroke a line that records 10 sheep and 1 promise. The promise is underlined. Somewhere an administrator with a good memory saved a winter. He closes the chest and leads you to a window punched through heavy stone. The sky is cooled to ink. Snowflakes tap the sill like small arguments that never escalate. A library, he says, is a city that learned how to sit still. Everyone who enters agrees to speak more quietly than their thoughts. You test the rule and discover your whisper has a speed limit. The librarian's eyebrow enforces it. That eyebrow could refreeze tea. A bell rings, low and round. He reties a bundle and returns it to its slot. "Help me with one more thing," he says. Together you carry 3 wrapped folios to a higher shelf, stepping onto a wooden stool that creaks like an elderly opinion. When you slide the books in, the row looks satisfied, as if the wall exhaled. Even architecture appreciates completion. Before you go, he tucks a sliver of scrap into your palm. A single character. Turn. Good advice for pages and for people. Doors, too. Outside, the corridor feels colder but less empty, as if the books have followed to the threshold to see you off. Maybe that's just the butter lamp draft. Maybe books travel farther than we think. You close the door. The latch gives a tiny brass chirp. Behind you, the hidden library settles into its breathing. Ahead, the plateau waits, and beyond it, travelers already climb, guided by rumors born in rooms like this, rumors that will pull distant seekers to these same shelves and make the snow listen again. You step back into the night with the library's paper, scent still clinging to your coat. The path dips toward a wind-bent cairn where old prayer flags knot around a wooden pole like travelers comparing maps. Footprints braid across the snow, boot treads wider than the locals wear. Foreign seekers have been here, hauling trunks, telescopes, notebooks, and very optimistic ideas about altitude. You follow the freshest pair until the snow thins and a ring of hearthstones appears, their rims polished by many fires. Someone boiled tea here, told stories here, and decided the map needed one more guess. You crouch beside a half-buried tin mug stamped with a European maker's mark. It feels like a calling card from a century ago. A mainstream fact keeps imagination from sprinting ahead. In 1924, the French-Belgian explorer and Buddhist practitioner Alexandra David-Néel reached Lhasa after years of study and travel. She later published My Journey to Lhasa, bringing careful accounts of Tibetan life and practice to Western readers. Her route is grit and patience, not postcard magic. Wind presses the fire ring flat and lets it breathe again. You picture another visitor, the Russian painter Nicholas Roerich, scanning the ridgelines in the 1920s, sketchbook open, reporting momentary visions of distant towers in high, dry air. His caravan hauls canvases through Central Asia like a moving gallery with altitude sickness. You imagine him squinting, then painting what he hopes to see. Artists do that. Seekers do too. The trail kinks east and drops into a basin with a frozen pool at the center. Scratched on the ice are initials, dates, and one carefully drawn star. Some people bring sextants, others bring geometry and good penmanship. A quirky tidbit rises as you trace the star's edges. David-Néel wrote of tulpas, thought forms shaped by rigorous practice, including a jolly monk figure she said later grew stubborn and had to be reabsorbed. Psychology, metaphor, or mountain cabin fever with literary flair, you file it under entertaining mysteries and keep walking. Along the rim, a brittle page from an English diary curls in the drift, its ink faded to tea color. One line survives. Shambhala may be a code for a discipline. You nod. That sentence travels well. A paragraph below it dissolves into nothing, which feels on brand for a kingdom that refuses head counts. Somewhere a yak snorts in the dark, as if to say the search party forgot snacks. You keep on until the basin narrows into a gorge that funnels sound like a horn. Voices pool and empty with the wind, giving you company you can't keep. You imagine caravans parking their hopes here, while cooks made tea and guides compared rumors. Historians still argue whether certain expeditions, Roerich's among them, were primarily spiritual quests, artistic tours, or political errands wrapped in sacred language. The record wears multiple hats. The trail remembers only hooves and boots. Fresh snow softens the gorge floor. You find a rusted tent stake and a broken wooden protractor. Somewhere a surveyor tried to persuade a mountain to pose for measurements. You encourage the missing instrument case. Nice effort. Then the mountain answers by snowing directly into your collar. Lesson received. The gorge opens onto a shoulder of land that leans toward the west. The horizon simplifies into clean layers, blue, darker blue, and a final band of charcoal. In that direction lie deserts, where other seekers drifted with maps half-finished. Another mainstream anchor steadies the view. The Swedish explorer Sven Hedin led multiple expeditions across Tibet and Central Asia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, mapping routes, rivers, and terrain that later scholars relied on. He chased lakes that moved, traced dry rivers to their fossils, and proved that stubborn curiosity can, in fact, outwalk very stubborn sand. You picture a mixed camp, a mystic, a geographer, and a trader warming their hands over the same stove, each hearing Shambhala and translating it into the thing they most need. The mystic hears sanctuary, the geographer hears coordinates, the trader hears a market you can't see yet, you hear the stove and want soup. Enlightenment is nice, dinner is persuasive. A gust rattles prayer flags and sends a tin spoon skating across the crust. You chase it and catch it with a flourish that earns applause from no one. You deserve applause anyway. On a boulder nearby, someone painted a small circle with 4 gates, then added an arrow labeled N. You consider leaving a note, not to scale, then remember that sacred graffiti ages badly in travelogues and decide to remain anonymous. The soundscape shifts from high hiss to a muffled stillness that tastes like snowflakes in pine. Your footsteps drum a patient tempo. You pass a tangle of pack straps and a wooden crate stenciled in French. You imagine the label, fragile, hope. Customs cannot tax that, though they try. Stories layer as you walk. Theosophists read Tibetan terms through Sanskrit lenses and fold Shambhala into a wide mythic tapestry stitched from India, Tibet, and a dash of Plato. Travelers mistake one monastery for the entrance and another for the back door. You picture monks redirecting them with tea and topographical realism. The secret door usually turns out to be a pantry. You crest a rise, and the long view makes cartographers bold and poets unbearable. You let the panorama sit, because any sentence you put on it would be scaffolding. Somewhere toward the hazy south, a hidden valley might hold a stone tower. Somewhere toward the east, a city may be aligned like a mandala. Somewhere toward your stomach, a memory of noodles requests a sequel. Down a slope you see cairns stacked with coins, tin saints, and a shockingly modern airline baggage tag that no one will claim. You add a small pebble because currency is complicated, but intentions are cheap. The wind approves with a softer tone. Another mainstream note keeps your feet honest. In 1933, James Hilton published Lost Horizon, inventing Shangri-La, a fictional lamasery inspired by Tibetan imagery. Western audiences often blurred Shangri-La with Shambhala, though the former is a modern literary creation and the latter arises from Tibetan Buddhist tradition centered on the Kalachakra. Two names, similar syllables, very different passports. Dusk puts gold in the clouds and navy in the shadows. You follow a line of cairns down to a cluster of winter huts, their doors chalked with protective syllables. A dog regards you as if you were a roomer arriving late. Someone inside laughs. You smell flower and juniper. A host steps out, bows, and offers a wooden bowl. You drink. It is warm and persuasive, and may be tea's ambitious cousin. Your toes return from their small Arctic expedition. Around the fire, the host recalls a stranger who traded a brass compass for dried apricots and asked if the valley ever moved. The host said, "Valleys do not move, but people do," which seemed to disappoint the stranger. You try not to laugh into your bowl. If a valley starts walking, everyone will notice. The host points to a wall where charms hang with keys and old coins. One is a pressed flower sealed in wax. A traveler left it, claiming it came from a garden no winter touches. The host shrugged then, and shrugs now. Quirky souvenir or field note from a warmer dimension? You assign it the category poetic evidence, which pairs well with tea. Night gathers. The host sets a lamp on the hearth and tells a short tale of a traveler who kept asking for directions to a city that might not be a place. The host finally pointed to the floor and said, "Start here." The traveler wrote this down as if it were coordinates. You decide that might be the best map anyone can give. You sleep on a thick mat while the dog patrols the threshold with professional gravitas. Outside, the gorge weather changes gears. In your last waking moments, you think of journals in many languages, all trying to pin a moving dancer to a still page. The pages survive. The dancer keeps dancing. You drift with the rhythm of bootsteps fading into old snow and new rumor. Dawn pads across the rafters like a patient cat. You sit up to the chiming of tin cups and the soft bark of the dog doing rounds with supervisory pride. The host ladles breakfast into wooden bowls and leans his elbow on the hearthstone. "Travelers," he says, "leave two kinds of stories here, gentle ones about wisdom and difficult ones about power." He stirs the fire as if sorting the pile into those two stacks. Sparks choose the ceiling and vanish. He starts with the hard flavor. In a certain cycle of years, he says, when confusion presses like low clouds, a king in the north adjusts the world's tempo. Armies grow quiet, as if remembering a forgotten drum. A mainstream fact anchors the steam curling from your bowl. The Kalachakra tradition describes a future ruler of Shambhala, often named Rigdan Drakpo or Rudra Chakran, who appears in a degenerate age, defeats forces hostile to the Dharma, and reestablishes harmony. The text gives dates in encoded cycles, names a capital laid out by mandala, and treats the event as assured, not hypothetical. You sip and let the warmth settle. The host's eyes glint. People hear prophecy and immediately imagine gadgets, he says. So a parade of rumors arrives, mirrors that reveal intentions, banners that cannot be burned, shells that sound one note and silence a charge. You picture a quartermaster trying to requisition one honesty mirror, two unburnable flags, and you quietly salute their paperwork. He lifts a brass object from the wall, a ritual vajra, dense and cool, diamond and thunderbolt in one hand-sized emblem. Weapons, he says without saying the word, come in many grammars. The Vajra in practice cuts delusion and steadies attention on a battlefield of minds that counts as heavy cavalry. He squares it on the mantle like a compass returning to north. The joke writes itself. If clarity came in plug-in form, the power strip in your apartment would look very holy. You ask about the more theatrical tales. He nods toward a shelf where a small black stone sits in a cradle of red cloth. Some visitors whisper about a wishing jewel, the Chintamani, a fallen star that hums when truth approaches and dims when pride walks in. A quirky tidbit fits neatly here. In the early 20th century, Nicholas Roerich and later admirers circulated stories about a mysterious stone linked to wisdom-bearing emissaries and a hidden kingdom. Skeptics suggest meteor lore dressed in robes, while believers point to coincidences that behaved like messages. The host shrugs. Stones are good listeners, he says. People bring them ambitious conversations. You chew a heel of bread that tastes like mountain weather and patience. Weapons and wisdom keep winding around each other in your mind. The host moves a kettle a finger's width and says a city survives on recipes more than on swords. Calendars that tell farmers when to turn soil, doctors who know which root to boil for which cough, judges who can cool a quarrel before it becomes a feud. You wonder if the most effective arsenal is a shelf of well-used minutes. It would make logistics departments proud and poets suspicious. Wind sniffs at the door. The dog answers with a thump of tail that translates as noted. The host tells an old tale of a drum whose rhythm unknotted panic in 1,000 hearts. Not a conquering crash, just a pattern that taught breath how to behave. The detail feels like folklore engineered by a meditator with a sense of acoustics. You imagine the customs declaration, one large drum, do not strike during turbulence. Somewhere an airline clerk nods gravely. He gestures to a rolled banner inked with 4 syllables that angle like birds mid-flight. These, he says, are the names of winds. Someone who knows how to call them can escort a storm away from a harvest or coax a fog to sit down and behave. You picture meteorology with manners. It would be a rating success. It would also ruin the suspense of picnic planning. On the hearth, a prayer wheel spins lazily on heat currents. The host steadies it with one finger. He speaks softly about power that does not photograph well, the skill to see conflict 3 moves ahead and reframe it before it hardens, the knack for building roads that lead arguments past each other without collision, the authority to say, pause, and have an entire valley obey long enough to remember kindness. He smiles. The best tool here is still silence used with intent, he said. Quantity 1, lifetime warranty. If there were a manual, it would have 108 chapters and no pictures. Historians still argue whether the martial imagery in Kalachakra texts refers to a literal apocalyptic campaign forecast by a community looking outward at threats, to an inner drama where barbarians are mental afflictions routed by discipline, or to a hybrid myth that let border peoples narrate survival with courage and poetry. Your host lets the question hang in the smoke between you like a lantern on a long hook. Interpretations share space the way cups share a shelf. He turns the conversation to things that can be learned without kings. He lists small disciplines with battlefield consequences, listening until an opponent says something truer than they intended, delegating not by title but by demonstrated calm, training scouts to notice tone as carefully as they notice tracks. You think of offices where those same skills would reduce email casualties. If only HR could issue a certificate in not escalating Tuesdays. A leather case by the door holds a conch. The host lifts it, breathes, and sets it down again without sounding it. This, he says, calls gatherers, and therefore responsibilities, not a toy. He points to the inner courtyard where children have etched chalk lines in a grid. Today, their game is a tiny city. Today, the chalk is a treaty. Tomorrow it will be weather. Every rumor of a mighty artifact, he says, has a smaller cousin you can practice with before you spill tea on destiny. You ask what happens when such stories leave the mountains. He sighs with the friendliness of an old boot. Outside listeners often amplify the power and lowercase the ethics, he says. Instruments travel faster than instructions. That is why elders hide technique inside parable. Anyone who ignores the story misses the switch that keeps the machine from biting the hand that holds it. You nod and promise your own hand stricter supervision. The dog noses your sleeve for crumbs and receives an education in disappointment. You stand and feel the room take its weight back. In the doorway, the host touches your shoulder with 2 fingers, the local equivalent of a stamp on a passport. He says the world's worst weapons are clumsy, loud, and easy to copy. The world's best protections are quiet, hard to teach, and line up your breath with your choices. You write that down on the only scrap of paper you trust, the inside of your attention. Outside, the gorge rehearses another weather change. Flags remember wind as skillfully as you remember breakfast. You glance back once. In the half-shadow, the black stone still sits, indifferent to debate, willing to glow for whoever arranges their face into honesty. You smile at the idea of a geology major specializing in sincerity. The job market would be odd but necessary. As you shoulder your pack, a half-heard rumor settles like a feather. Those who finally cross into the bright city do not carry devices, banners, or drums. They arrive empty enough to be shown a calendar and a kitchen. The joke is gentle and persistent. The password to the secret fortress is, "How can I help?" Power leaves by a different door than it entered, and the valley keeps a careful ledger of which kind is which. You follow the cairns upward, step after step, and let talk of weapons dissolve into a simpler arrangement: snow, breath, horizon. Somewhere between them a rhythm finds you, small as a pulse, steady as a lamp. It asks for not much. It offers a path wide enough for one set of feet and a good idea. You accept both and make for the pass. The pass lifts you into thin, ceremonial light. From a saddle between peaks you see an open square roofed by sky, prayer poles at the corners like compass points. Pilgrims in layered wool gather along stone steps. A loudspeaker hums, then clears its throat. You find a seat where the wind behaves. A monk unfurls a thanka that catches the morning like a sail. Concentric rings, palaces, gates, a central figure seated calm as a mountain lake. You recognize the geometry you walked last night, now painted and portable. The announcer welcomes seekers from many valleys and a few countries new to this altitude. Hats, thermoses, and caution share the steps. A mainstream fact grounds the moment. The 14th Dalai Lama has conferred the Kalachakra initiation more than 30 times since the 1950s across India, Mongolia, Europe, and North America, presenting Shambhala within the Kalachakra tradition to vast audiences. The ritual builds a sand mandala, teaches stages of practice, and ends by sweeping the mandala away to emphasize impermanence. Today is a local teaching, the monk says, but the thread is the same. You listen as he quotes the Dalai Lama's plain advice: do not wait for a mythic army. Cultivate ethics, patience, and clarity so that when confusion swells, your breath does not help it. The words are not dramatic, which is why they are usable. You make a note to upgrade your daily software from scrolling to sitting. The wind freshens. He speaks about Shambhala with 2 lenses. In the first, Shambhala is a pure land, a realm of awakened governance approachable by those with the karmic connection and the training to perceive it. In the second, Shambhala is a template for a society that remembers wisdom while buying vegetables. The pair do not contradict, they braid. He tells the story carried in the Kalachakra texts, a lineage of kings who preserve the teaching, and, in an age of disorder, a final Rigdon who appears to restore balance. He points away from melodrama. The prophecy, he says, is not a cue for spectators. It is a job description for citizens. If you want a seat in the orchestra, practice your instrument. You glance at your lungs, which pretend to be woodwinds, and immediately squeak. A fringe curiosity drifts by. Some visitors insist the Dalai Lama once hid coordinates to Shambhala in a sand mandala, a pattern readable only from above before the sand was poured into a river. The rumor returns every few years with the persistence of a house cat and exactly as much documentation. The crowd laughs when the monk says the only coordinates reliably given are kindness at latitude, discipline at longitude. The thanka tilts as attendants anchor its lower rods with stones. A translator repeats the core lines in another language, then another. The square turns into a small United Nations of thermoses. Your neighbor offers dried apricot with the solemnity of a treaty. You reciprocate with your last emergency cookie. Historians still argue whether contemporary Tibetan leaders' public framing of Shambhala reflects a primarily symbolic pedagogy adapted for global audiences, a faithful restatement of traditional eschatology taken literally by believers, a pragmatic blend of both, so practice proceeds regardless of metaphysics. The debate is civil, except when someone weaponizes footnotes. The monk lifts a conch, does not blow it, and sets it down. He explains the discipline of restraint. A signal unused is still a signal. He outlines the Kalachakra in brief, outer cycles of time that govern calendars, inner cycles of breath that govern attention, and subtler cycles chosen only after long preparation. You imagine your calendar app trying to schedule "Remember Impermanence" and bursting into compassionate flames. He quotes again, "When people ask where Shambhala is, the Dalai Lama often points to responsibility rather than to maps. The location that matters is the one where you act." Jokes ripple as the monk says the kingdom is not on a GPS, though, if it were, the voice would politely suggest, "In 5 breaths, turn left." From the steps, a lay teacher adds an everyday list that sounds like policy. Fair courts, schools that teach both logic and kindness, clinics that treat bodies and tempers, and leaders who measure decisions by how many people sleep well. You feel the crowd nod. If an app delivered that, it would top every chart and then retire. The wind ebbs, sunlight leans against the thangka, and the painted gates look briefly ajar. Your mind does the thing minds do. It tries to walk through paint. You smile and let the urge pass. A child behind you asks if Shambhala has noodles. The monk answers yes, and good ones, but only for those who wash the bowls. A second monk cautions against mixing myths. Western readers often blend Shangri-La, a modern novel's invention, with Shambhala, the Buddhist vision linked to Kalachakra. Both sound like refuge. Only one belongs to liturgy. The square hums with recognition. The session closes with a simple practice, hands together, 3 slow breaths that do not belong to anyone. In the quiet, you notice how far sound travels when it is not pushed. Prayer flags answer with a small grammar of silk and wind. The monk thanks the mountains for attending and the crowd for not falling off the steps. As people rise, you linger. The thangka's center seems less like a portrait and more like a mirror that asks better questions than it answers. Perhaps that is the point. You shoulder your pack and realize your posture has improved without permission. On the way out, you pass a table where elders hand out printed pages, short quotes and longer schedules. You take one. It says only, "When confusion is loud, become a steady room." That fits in a pocket. It also fits most emergencies. You descend toward the saddle where the wind resumes its regular programming. Behind you, the square dissolves into rock and sky, as if the lesson packed itself neatly. You test a joke on the air. If Shambhala had a press office, it would specialize in weather reports and breathing tips, and the breeze accepts it without comment. Your steps find a rhythm that sounds like quiet applause from inside your chest. You follow a contour line that once served more urgent feet. The path broadens into an old military road, stones set shoulder to shoulder like veterans. Prayer flags tighten in the wind, and the mountains listen with the serious face of a council. You are not the first to cross here with stories in your pocket. Others carried orders, omens, and a strong desire for warmer socks. The valley below holds terraces and the quiet geometry of fields, but its ridges remember armor. You stop where a wall of stacked rock climbs a knoll. A horn once lived here, long as a canoe, its note crossing valleys faster than any rider. A guide points to faint ramparts and names eras as if pages, the time of the Koshit horsemen, the Zungar winter, the Qing return, the Gorkha push, and the British column that arrived with gear, etiquette, and Maxim guns. The air goes thin when history lists its guests that way. A mainstream fact steadies the ground. In 1903-1904, a British expedition led by Colonel Francis Young Husband forced its way into Tibet, fought engagements at places like Guru and Gyantse, and compelled the Lhasa Convention. The campaign opened a closed frontier and left accounts that still make readers hold their breath. You picture supply lists that included biscuits, grappling hooks, and a crisp sense of destiny. Wind carries a dry smell of juniper. You walk along the wall, and your boots dislodge small avalanches of pebbles, a polite reminder that even rocks practice retreat. Below, a fortress sits on a hill like a clenched hand. You imagine lookouts measuring clouds the way sailors measure swell. An army here competes with altitude before it ever meets an opponent. You consider filing a complaint with the mountain's HR department. The mountain declines comment. Earlier pages turn. You step through a pass where the 17th century still echoes. Riders from the Koshut, led by Gushi Khan, once crossed these snows to back the 5th Dalai Lama and install the Ganden Phodrang government in 1642. The alignment of religion and rule redrew local gravity. The trails learned new names for the same slopes. You press your fingers to a prayer carved in stone and feel the grain answer with cold confidence. Another ridge remembers the Dzungar incursion of 1717, when Western Mongol forces seized Lhasa. People hid, alliances bent, and the wind learned to carry quieter footsteps. Within 3 years, the Qing sent a large expedition. In 1720, imperial troops entered the city, restoring order and enthroning the youth later known as the 7th Dalai Lama. The dates sit like cairns. You move between them and notice how the sky changes only a little while governments change a lot. You pass a shrine stuffed with talismans, knotted cords, stamped coins, and a tiny bronze of a wrathful figure who looks like he takes punctuality seriously. A shepherd says old soldiers trusted charms against arrows and later against bullets. A quirky tidbit pushes the door wider. British accounts from 1904 describe Tibetan fighters wearing amulets for protection and beating great drums that rolled thunder down the slopes. Some witnesses also reported armor of layered leather and mail that looked medieval beside modern guns. Faith, tradition, and logistics met on the same hillside and debated outcomes in real time. The wind drops, and you hear water fussing under ice. You follow it to a shelf where astrologers once read the sky before leaders chose a march date. A scribe's scratch survives on a flat stone. A circle, 12 marks, 2 crossed lines. You smile. Even strategy meetings here come with constellations. Somewhere a modern project manager tries to add Mercury Direct to a calendar invite, and the app refuses on principle. Downslope, the terraces knit into a village whose lanes turn like thought. Old men play dice in a sunlit corner and argue about a winner no one can quite date. One swears a column came looking for a door beyond the north. Another says no one searches for doors in a blizzard unless they have already made up their mind. Historians still argue whether invaders in different centuries were motivated in part by legends, seeking control over a sacred center, a rumored treasure, or a symbolic capital, or whether the campaigns were entirely about trade, borders, and leverage dressed in holy language. The sources do not always confess their metaphors. You climb to a lookout where the horizon decides to be enormous. The road below throws its switchbacks like a string of questions. You imagine the British column inching there, horses with steam for manes, porters with ropes webbed across their chests, and officers reconciling maps with mountains that keep a poker face. Somewhere in that procession, a young soldier wonders how to write home about a sky that refuses punctuation. Your guide points to a notch where the Sino-Nepalese War touched the plateau in 1791 to 1792, after Gorkha forces pressed north and Qing troops moved up to answer. The notch wears no uniform now. It lends weather equally to every passerby. The guide says the ridge served messages, not just armies. Traders, pilgrims, and singers carried news faster than banners. You picture fresh tea preceded by last week's rumor, both arriving hot. You rest beside a half-buried wheel hub, the wood fossil hard. The metal band shines where wind has polished it smooth. You think of caravans as long arguments with gravity that end triumphantly in markets. Wars interrupt markets, then try to become them. A crow lands, inspects the hub, and decides it is neither edible nor interesting. You admire the scientific method. Across the saddle, a ruined watchtower hunches against the sky. You climb its steps and stand where lookouts once learned to name dust by the way it rose. Wide for herds, broken for carts, straight and fast for riders who had something to prove. The platform creaks with the memory of cold hands in a job that never rested. You find yourself estimating lines of sight and, in a moment of honesty, snack opportunities. Logistics is the parent of courage. Another page turns with a softer hand. The Nechung Oracle, state medium of Old Lhasa, once advised leaders when storms gathered, storm of weather, storm of politics. In hard seasons, governments everywhere consult oracles of one kind or another, economists, generals, algorithms, or whatever voice claims to read the pattern behind the noise. Up here, the robe was different, the function rhymed. You wonder who reads the pattern for your own decisions and briefly suspect it is your breakfast. The road bends toward a high plain stubbled with sage. A felled standard lies half hidden, its finial dented, the gold long gone or never there. You run a finger along its grain and feel the story it wanted, to be upright, to point windward, to announce arrival. It got weather instead. Most of us do. You set it back carefully and the plane nods its approval by not tripping you immediately. Some travelers say that soldiers in certain wars asked about a fabled northern capital where righteous kings still watched the world and would ride at the final hour. Did recruits believe they might find an envoy on these ridges? Or did the legend ride with them as a private reassurance that order waited somewhere beyond the next pass? You can't audit their hearts, but you can count footfalls and see how faith, rumor, and fear braid into rope strong enough to pull an army uphill. Evening arrives with professional efficiency. The sky cools to iron, and the first star reports for duty. You pitch your small tent beside the foundation of something that once received orders and sent them away again. The stones sleep easily. They have heard louder nights. You cook a quick meal that claims to be soup and accept the claim because appetite is a generous editor. Joke 1. If supply lines were a religion, you would be a devout adherent by now. Steam fogs the air. You write a few notes by headlamp: snow, horn, wall, rumor. You add a line you hope you'll remember later. Campaigns try to capture maps. People try to capture mornings. It sounds wiser than you feel. You blame altitude and endorse hydration. Joke 2. If wisdom came in tablets, you would set an alarm and take 2 with tea. Before sleep, you bow to the silence that returns after armies leave. The mountains keep the music stand. The score departs with the band. Somewhere a fox stitches night to snow in small, neat steps. In the distance, the ruined tower practices being a star chart holder. Joke 3 arrives on schedule. Tomorrow, you will conquer the ambitious objective of not slipping on your own tent line. Empires rise and fall. Self-respect survives by tripping less. You close your eyes. The past remembers hooves but forgives boots. The old road forgets names but keeps directions. In your last waking breath, you hear a long horn from a century ago fold into the wind and become weather again. The heart answers with a simpler instrument: in, out, alive. Morning comes like a careful librarian, shelving the stars and opening the sky by degrees. You shake frost from the tent, boil water that pretends to be coffee, and follow a sheep path into a valley where roofs wear red clay and the market opens with the creak of shutters. A small museum sits above a tea stall, its door propped by a brick that has retired from construction and taken up civic duty. Inside, the air smells of dust, wool, and patient arguments. Photographs line the walls: caravans, surveyors, unfamiliar uniforms, and faces that looked at horizons professionally. A caretaker in a felt hat gestures you toward a case of maps. Turkestan bleeds into Tibet in shaky inks. The Pamir sits like a fist. The Altai crouches in the north like a thoughtful bear. He points with a pencil at routes traced in disciplined pencil strokes. Some were for trade, some for science, some for politics, and a few, he says, were for dreams that filed paperwork. You raise an eyebrow. He nods. The paperwork was the heavy part. Joke 1 lands without turbulence. He lifts a photograph of a man in a scholar's robe, standing in front of a sloping roof that looks surprisingly at home under northern skies. A mainstream fact steadies your gaze. Between 1909 and 1915, the Buddhist temple in St. Petersburg, Datsun Gunzechoinai, was built with the support of the Buryat Lama Agvan Dorjiev, a diplomat for the 13th Dalai Lama. It was one of the first large Buddhist temples in Europe, a tangible thread between the Russian Empire and the Tibetan world. The caretaker taps the glass. Connections are older than slogans. Next, he slides open a drawer and produces a brittle pamphlet printed in Russian and Mongolian. The title mentions Northern Shambhala, and the text urges unity, discipline, and a moral renovation of society. Your finger hovers above the ink. He lowers his voice the way people do before sharing gossip history already knows. A quirky tidbit. In the 1920s, Bolshevik security men and esoteric enthusiasts, names like Gleb Boki and Alexander Barchenko appear in memoirs, flirted with the idea of a Shambhala project, blending parapsychology, inner Asian geopolitics, and myth. Plans surfaced for expeditions to the Altai and beyond, chasing sources of wisdom and, perhaps, influence. Files later closed, people later vanished into purges. The rumor of red-robed seekers with party cards survives like a smudge in the archive. You look again at the routes etched across the map. Scientific teams threaded them too. The caretaker points to a caption about high-altitude surveys. Geologists climbed for fossils of seas that forgot to leave. Glaciologists measured the long, slow grammar of ice. One joint venture reached the Pamirs with barometers and notebooks, proving that not every tent in these winds was pitched for prophecy. The caretaker smiles thinly. Even scientists told good campfire stories. On a back wall, a photo shows a Buryat scholar with a camera case and the look of someone who trusts his feet. The caption explains that Russian Buryat pilgrims reached Lhasa around 1900. One of them, Gombozhab Tsibikov, later published early photographs of the city in 1905, widening Western eyes without widening any roads. The caretaker taps the glass again. Pictures cross borders even when people cannot. You lean on a display case that once tried to be level and gave up. A note scotch-taped to the glass quotes, translated, an agenda from a Soviet club in a frontier town. Lecture, Buddhism and the Scientific View. Demonstration, radio telephony. You squint. The juxtaposition feels exactly 1920s. In the next room, a heavy radio set sits on a crate, its dials serene in retirement. You imagine young operators asking the ether to say something interesting. Joke 2 creeps up. Telepathy would have saved the Ministry of Fortune in telegrams. The caretaker spreads a news clipping with a headline about mystical agitation. He shrugs. Frontier politics borrowed any story that moved hearts and horses. In some places, pamphleteers whispered about a Shambhala war where righteous rulers would cleanse corruption. In other places, scouts whispered about taxes. Historians still argue whether early Soviet flirtations with Buddhist millenarian language were strategic theater, sincere experiments by a few unconventional officials, or a brief strange bricolage of both that dissolved when the state hardened. The debate has footnotes shaped like caution signs. You ask about names. He mentions Dorjiev again, a bridge builder who tried to locate Buddhist security inside Russian protection before revolutions rewrote the ledger. He mentions Buryat and Kalmyk monks who navigated new ideologies like skilled boatmen reading a difficult river. Some cooperated, some resisted, many suffered when policy turned to iron in the 1930s. He speaks quietly. The room shifts from curiosity to respect. You keep the jokes parked. Back in the market air, a wind flips a pile of postcards. One shows the painter Nicholas Roerich in a wool cap, easel planted in gravel. You remember earlier stories of his caravan and his shimmering towers. The caretaker acknowledges him with a careful nod, the way one nods at clouds that sometimes look like castles. Roerich's travels overlapped with Soviet and American interests. His letters braided art, diplomacy, and apocalypse with a confident hand. People still disagree on which thread he held most firmly. A boy wanders over with a wooden toy airplane and asks if the museum has any engines. The caretaker says no, only maps. The boy sighs as if maps are vegetables. You buy him a hot bun that defeats cynicism with butter. Joke 3 wins the crowd of 2. You drift toward a bulletin board where yellowed notices still recruit for study societies, philosophy, language, and psychophysiology of attention. The fonts have opinions. A penciled note in the margin reads, "Meeting moved because the wind attended too." You decide that is the best bureaucratic sentence of the decade. At the edge of town stands a squat concrete building with a star faded to the color of dust. Its roofline carries the stubborn dignity of structures that outlived their paperwork. A woman sells tea from the doorway and tells you her grandfather rode with a mixed unit, soldiers, translators, surveyors, up toward a pass to talk about borders and other weather. He said the men argued about compasses versus stars, then fell silent when the sky clarified both. He also said the only time everyone agreed instantly was when soup was served. You skirt the compound wall, where a mural survives under chalk and rain, a wheel, a book, and a radio tower outlined with surprising tenderness. The caption, nearly erased, reads, "Learn the pattern." In the corner, a joker has added, "Then return the pattern on time." You applaud the anonymous wit and consider mailing them a library card. Farther along, an old telegraph line limps across the slope, poles leaning like tired exclamation points. The wire sings in the wind, a dry, humming testimony to messages that once mattered urgently and now matter as archaeology. You lay your palm against a pole and feel a faint vibration. The mountain is on the line. The operators have stepped out. The caretaker catches up and says technicians used to claim they could tell a storm's distance by the wire's tone. You decide they were all secret poets, paid in rations. In the late light, the valley starts packing up its shop signs. You sit on a low wall with a tin cup and try to assemble the day. Revolutionaries who borrowed myths, monks who spoke with diplomats, scientists who measured glaciers, and also listened to campfire prophecies without taking notes. The 20th century did not so much tidy the legend as remix it. Some tracks charted, some tracks whispered, some tracks vanished when the DJ left. A final mainstream point settles in like an index entry. By the late 1930s, Soviet religious policy turned harsh. Most Buddhist institutions within Soviet borders were shuttered, clergy repressed, and that short season of official curiosity ended in fear. The museum's silence respects that page without trying to explain it away. As dusk takes the color from the market, the caretaker locks the door and presses a folded copy of a route sketch into your hand. He says the path north toward the high grasslands is clear if the wind agrees. He adds, almost casually, that sometimes the best way to track an expedition is to follow the jokes it left behind. Serious people forget to be funny. Dreamers spill humor like breadcrumbs. You shoulder your pack. The telegraph wire gives one last dry chord. Somewhere in those tones lives a file folder stamped interesting that no one ever finished reading. You step into the slope's long twilight and feel the story tilt west, where other listeners misunderstood a Himalayan word and made it their own. The wind takes your scarf, returns it, and pretends nothing happened. You thank it for the lesson in foreign policy. You walk out of the museum's shadow and follow a road that trades stone for asphalt, yaks for buses, and prayer flags for billboards. The slope flattens into a rail town where a second-hand bookshop leans against a cafe, and both smell faintly of paper, espresso, and optimistic rain. Inside, a shelf labeled Mysticism and Maps offers cracked spines, travelers' journals, theosophical tomes, and paperbacks with mountains that look suspiciously retouched. The clerk rings up incense with the solemnity of a customs agent. Joke 1. The incense has a speed limit now. Titles braid into a single river of meanings. A mainstream fact anchors the shelf. In 1933, James Hilton published Lost Horizon, coining Shangri-La, a fictional lamasery modeled on Tibetan imagery. Frank Capra's 1937 film amplified it for global audiences. The word became shorthand for an earthly utopia hidden in mountains, and Western readers often blurred it with Shambhala, the Buddhist vision tied to the Kalachakra. 2 ideas, 1 suitcase, many flights. You scribble, "Do not check this bag." The clerk points to a framed newspaper clipping. During World War II, President Franklin D. Roosevelt jokingly told reporters that the Doolittle Raiders had come from Shangri-La, and soon after named the presidential retreat the same. Later, an aircraft carrier took the name USS Shangri-La. Quirky, yes, and proof that a fictional refuge can end up stamped on steel and letterhead. You picture a sailor explaining to a grandmother that he serves aboard a metaphor. She nods and sends cookies anyway. Across the aisle, theosophy gathers like a weather system. Helena Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine hums with talk of hidden masters and inner Asia. Later writers fold Shambhala into a network of subterranean wisdom capitals with names like Agart H.A. Some sketches look like visionary geography, others like the world's most mystical subway map. You flip a page and half expect to find transfer instructions at Temple of the Moon, next stop. Joke 2. Your transit card does not cover enlightenment zones. In a softer corner, pamphlets from the 1960s and 1970s smell of mimeograph ink and idealism. Communes, meditation groups, and East-West centers invited seekers to build better towns with better tempers. A mainstream fact steps through. After 1959, the Tibetan diaspora carried teachings to India, and from there, across Europe and North America. By the 1970s, Tibetan Buddhist centers were established in cities from London to New York and Boulder. Teachers framed Shambhala both as a distant Pure Land and as a model for enlightened society where ethics, clarity, and compassion inform daily life. A flyer tacked by the door features a grainy photo of a young Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche in a Western suit. It notes the founding of Naropa Institute in Boulder in 1974 and the creation of secular Shambhala training, a curriculum aimed at cultivating wakeful citizenship without requiring monastic vows. The mainstream point holds, Naropa, now a university, became the first accredited Buddhist-inspired institution of higher learning in the United States, and for many seekers the word Shambhala shifted from mythic geography to civic aspiration. The flyer's typography insists the revolution begins with good posture. You try on the idea in the mirror of the cafe window, a kingdom as a code of conduct. Streets that breathe, courts that listen, schools that teach logic and kindness in the same hour. It sounds both grand and domestic, like a utopia with a grocery list. The barista calls a golden milk latte, and somewhere a pundit faints. Joke 3. If your city council added a nap and compassion line item, budget meetings might finish before lunch. Not every echo is careful. A rotating rack sells Shambhala-branded spa vouchers that promise transcendence by Thursday. A travel poster offers Shambhala Trek, guaranteed sighting of mystery. You imagine the guarantee department and send thoughts and prayers. Historians still argue whether Western appropriations of Himalayan terms represent sincere translation, creative reinvention that keeps ideas alive, or a flattening that sells the sizzle and loses the stove. The rack squeaks neutrally. You follow the argument into a gallery where thangkas hang beside abstract canvases. Wall text explains how exiled artists adapted old iconography with modern pigments, and how curators wrestled with labels that pleased neither purists nor promoters. A docent notes that the Dalai Lama's public Kalachakra events in Western cities framed Shambhala's message as ethical practice over treasure hunt, and thousands came for breath and community rather than coordinates. The docent's badge reads, "Ask me about mandalas." You do briefly, then spare everyone a sand spill. Another case holds a yellowed copy of Ferdinand Ossendowski's 1922 bestseller, Beasts, Men, and Gods, with its tales of a subterranean realm and a king of the world. Scholars still debate how much came from Mongolian rumor, how much from literary embroidery, and how much from the author's need to sell books during a dangerous escape. The curator winks toward the label Adventurous Reportage. Your inner librarian files it under Use with Salt. Evening pours in through tall windows. A small circle of readers gathers for a talk titled Utopia After the News Cycle. The speaker describes how myths travel. They leave one ecology, shed a few feathers, pick up new ones, and land in a neighborhood that needs them. Shambhala, in this telling, becomes both a compass for inner weather and a blueprint for town meetings, traffic calming, bias training, public parks where people actually sit near people they don't know. The speaker pauses. You realize the myth is less about escape than maintenance. Someone asks whether mixing Shangri-La and Shambhala damaged the original signal. The speaker answers that metaphors compete like radio stations. The stronger transmitter wins for a while. Hilton's lamasery supplied romance. Buddhist teachers supply method. Today, many listeners can tell the stations apart, even if the names still tangle on travel posters. Another asks about evidence. The reply is practical. The measurable fact is changed behavior. Fewer sharp emails, more shared dishes, calmer choices when the street gets loud. If you need a relic, borrow a good meeting agenda. You step back into the night with a bag of paper and a head full of overlapping maps. Neon hums. A yoga studio across the street exhales a class of sleepy humans who look like they just negotiated with their hamstrings. A bus sighs. A siren somewhere changes its mind, and a bookstore cat locks eyes with you as if to say that wisdom is simply not knocking over the display. You comply and are instantly wiser. At the corner, a mural shows a city block painted as a mandala, bakery at one gate, clinic at another, school and library completing the circle. In the center, a fountain lifts and settles like breath. A plaque reads, "Remember the kingdom by how you stand in line." It is not as cinematic as a golden palace, but it might be sturdier after winter. You mark the thought and find your stride. By the time the streetlights blink, the word that has crossed mountains and languages has been resized to your pocket. Not an escape hatch, a kind of homework. You walk toward the dark edge of town where roads leave names and become directions. The mountains are out there somewhere, polishing the moon. The legend, extended, has moved into your calendar with suspiciously practical requests. You agree to at least one. You add it to tomorrow. You leave the shop lights behind and let the road thin into gravel, then footpath, then the kind of line a map would draw only out of politeness. The night tastes like iron and pine. Above, the sky arranges itself into committees. Stars form panels. Orion looks ready to chair. You stop where a boulder has adopted the shape of a bench and let the day lay out its exhibits. Thankas and train schedules, prophecies and planning boards, pure lands and public parks. The question rises on its own, simple and stubborn. What exactly have you been walking toward? Symbol, myth, or a place that will accept mail? A breeze carries the dry flap of one old prayer flag. You imagine three guides stepping from the dark to plead their cases. The first, a philosopher with sleeves inked by commentary, says Shambhala is a teaching device, a mandala big enough to live in. Learn its geometry and you learn how to stand in line without losing your humanity. The second, a geographer with boots that remember rivers, says the kingdom is somewhere north of somewhere else. Give me a month and a mule and I'll find a pass that explains the rest. The third, a monk with pockets full of wicks, says both of you are arguing over shadows. Keep a flame steady and the room will name itself. You take minutes and lose your objectivity at flame steady. A mainstream fact sits down beside you. Across Tibetan and Himalayan traditions, sand mandalas are made grain by grain and then swept away at the ritual's end to teach impermanence. Museums have filmed the practice. Audiences have watched beauty built and released on purpose. In other words, the culture that speaks of a perfected city also trains its listeners to hold even beauty lightly. That tension is not a bug, it's the operating system. You flip your notebook to a page that has tried to be helpful and mostly succeeded. On it, you draw 3 columns. Column 1, symbol, Shambhala as code for the disciplined mind and the ethical city. Column 2, myth, Shambhala as a story that travels because people need a horizon that forgives their tired feet. Column 3, hidden reality, Shambhala as a valley with weather, markets, and a post office that sorts very polite letters. You doodle stamps shaped like mandalas and snort at yourself. Joke 1. If the postal clerk asks regular or enlightened, you will choose whichever comes with tracking. Footsteps crunch. A local scholar out for air recognizes your expression, the face people wear when they're skirmishing with nouns. She sits a respectful step away and proposes a 4th column, Shambhala as practice with consequences. If the story makes you kinder and steadier, the story just became real enough. It is the opposite of a tourist guarantee. It is a behavioral contract. You nod and try to staple the idea to your habits. A quirky tidbit knocks on the door of your skepticism and waits with exaggerated patience. Certain modern fringe circles splice Shambhala into a network of inner Earth cities, claim it runs on crystal engines, and suggest select visitors commute by tunnel or beam. The stories come with diagrams that look like spiritual subway maps edited by a very enthusiastic geode. You mark the margin, entertaining, unverified, and likely to void the warranty on your geology degree. You walk again, letting gravel correct your stride. Downslope, a hamlet keeps late hours, 1 radio, 3 dogs, a window where someone is teaching a child multiplication and mercy. Above slope, the ridge holds its breath. Historians still argue whether references to Shambhala's kings record a remembered polity refracted through devotion, a pedagogical scaffold mapping inner progress onto outer royal imagery, or a hope-soaked myth that fortified border peoples with a future worth standing through winter for. The question is honest, the sources are shy, the answer may be plural. You try on the possibilities the way people try on coats. If Shambhala is symbol only, the coat fits everywhere, light, breathable, never out of season. If Shambhala is myth only, the coat is dramatic, looks good on posters, and leaks in the rain. If Shambhala is also a place, the coat has pockets with receipts, tax ledgers, irrigation schedules, lists of who borrowed which book and brought it back on time. You realize you respect pockets. At a bend, frost has turned the path into firm glitter. You test each step as if ethics were underfoot. That seems correct. Ahead, a simple shrine waits under a leaning pine, a wheel painted in flaking red, a plate with 3 stones, and a note in 2 languages that says, "Leave what you can carry." You add a small joke you've been hoarding and take only the reminder that jokes weigh less when shared. Joke 2. If someone ever builds a Shambhala theme park, the lone ride will be a queue that moves so compassionately no one wants to leave it. From the trees, an older man with a pack full of tools appears, nods, and asks what you're measuring. You admit you're measuring trust. He says trust has the same maintenance schedule as bridges. He once built both. He taps the wheel. Symbol, he says, teaches hands how to move. Myth keeps hands moving when weather says stop. Hidden places? He shrugs. Some valleys hide from maps, some hearts do too. He tightens a strap and exits with the dignity of someone who owns better answers than he speaks. You set your lamp on the boulder and let its circle of light decide the size of the debate. A moth tries to attend and fails upward. You make a list of things that can be real in more than one way: music, grief, mathematics, love, law. None of those require coordinates to prove themselves. Why would a kingdom that trains people to act like better neighbors measure itself only in miles? Another mainstream point keeps your compass honest. Modern Tibetan teachers often present Shambhala in 2 registers at once, Pure Land and Practical Model, and encourage students not to postpone ethics until after metaphysics is solved. Public teachings cite the Kala Chakra, yes, but return listeners to grocery lines and meetings as the laboratory. That rhetorical habit is documented and observable without special equipment. Your only equipment is shoes and a willingness to stand still when standing still is harder. The ridge opens to a view that auditions for metaphor and gets the part. Villages light one by one, scattered like careful punctuation. You can almost read the slope as a sentence that learned to breathe between clauses. The thought arrives without a drum roll. Perhaps the debate is not a courtroom with winners, but a chorus where parts keep time for each other. Symbol sings harmony under myth's melody. Geography adds rhythm you can walk to. You do not resolve the song, you remember the tune. A cloud pulls across the moon like a shade, lowered for intermission. You pour water, watch the steam write short essays and then forget them, and decide your verdict will be operational. If a story makes you refuse a harmful shortcut, the story has entered the world as surely as a road. If a ritual teaches you to dismantle what you've built so you don't worship your own handiwork, the ritual just saved a neighborhood. If a map persuades you to carry less and notice more, it has earned its legends. You shoulder your pack. It feels half a thought lighter. Joke 3 volunteers. When you finally file your trip report, the field labeled Location of Findings will read, In Transit mostly. You picture a clerk stamping it approved with a seal shaped like a small, amused sun. As you step off the boulder, the prayer flag catches a pocket of wind and claps once. It sounds like a vote taken by fabric. The trail answers with its own approval. Yes, continue. You walk the dividing line where arguments prefer to wander, and the night lets you carry all 3 columns without demanding you choose. Below, a dog barks, then decides the universe is fine and returns to its nap. Above, the Star Committee adjourns without minutes. Somewhere between them, your breath adopts a modest agenda and meets it. By the time the path tucks into the next stand of pines, you have reduced the debate to a practice. Keep your lamp trimmed, your pockets honest, your map kind. If a hidden gate opens later, you will be dressed for it. If it does not, the road will still have become a better neighbor to your feet. The kingdom is either ahead or already underfoot. Either way, you walk. The trail folds into pines, and then into a ledge that looks like a thought pausing before it speaks. You set down your pack, lean your back against stone still warm from the sun, and reduce the world to breath and birdsong. The day's errands, maps, museums, arguments stand politely outside the door of your attention and wait their turn. The door, for the moment, stays closed. Your ribcage does slow work. The mountain agrees to lend you air at wholesale rates. The kingdom that kept hiding behind passes begins to clear its throat somewhere closer than your shadow. You count 4 breaths without improving them, then 8, then the number forgets to matter. A fly patrols the rim of your cup with bureaucratic efficiency, fails to write you a ticket, and moves on. You smile because even small irritations seem to have been hired to teach patience on contract. The trunk of a nearby pine is tattooed with resin and weather. It has read more winters than you have read books. You let its stillness teach a class with no exam. Joke 1. If enlightenment is graded on a curve, this tree ruins the bell for everyone. Wind slides through the needles and changes the room's acoustics. You remember a line from the teachings you heard on the steps: outer cycles, inner cycles, subtler cycles. A mainstream fact gives the thought a spine. The Kalachakra system presents an outer cycle of time tied to astronomy and calendars, an inner cycle related to the body's winds and channels, and an alternative or other cycle cultivated through meditation and visualization. The terms vary by translation, but scholars and practitioners alike recognize the threefold frame. Geography might hide a city, practice maps the traffic of attention. You adopt beginner's sincerity and borrow a simple exercise from a page you folded into your pocket. Watch breath arrive, watch it leave, treat each as a guest you don't need to impress. Eyes half-lidded, you let the forest drift out of focus. A mandala you walked in frost turns inside out and starts to fit behind your sternum. 4 gates become 4 attitudes you can open without paperwork. The center platform becomes a chair you remember how to sit in. The king, inconveniently, looks like whoever listens. On the edge of hearing, a stream argues gently with stones and then concedes both sides won. You let sound label distance and then peel off the labels. A moth performs ambitious geometry through a shaft of light and demonstrates the syllabus for distraction. You pass the course by refusing extra credit. In the warm pocket behind your navel, calm arrives with the modesty of a clerk and starts quietly filing your reactions under "not urgent." A quirky tidbit knocks with cold fingers. Travelers swap stories of meditators on winter retreats practicing tummo, inner heat, so effectively that wet sheets draped over their shoulders steam in the night air. Studies in the late 20th century measured temperature changes and made headlines, skeptics muttered. Believers shrugged and put more wood on the fire. You keep your jacket on, but you grant the possibility that attention, trained well, borrows levers you haven't found yet. You try compassion practice the way you try a doorway, gently and with the option to step back out. On the in-breath, you imagine borrowing the ache of a village somewhere you will never see. On the out-breath, you picture sending back warmth paid for with nothing but consent. It is not grand, it is not cinematic. It is a competent faucet, turn, flow, return, a pedestrian miracle that no one will photograph. Joke 2, if apps ever gamify kindness correctly, you will finally hit a leaderboard worth bragging about to exactly no one. A woodpecker clocks in 3 trees away and conducts quality control on the bark. You let the staccato set tempo. Each tap is a metronome. Each pause is permission. Thoughts arrive dressed as emails. You unsubscribe without reading. Another thought arrives disguised as an apology from your calendar app for scheduling worries during off hours. You accept the apology and delete the meeting. The quiet grows enough to have furniture. Historians still argue whether reading Shambhala as primarily an inner training, with governance as its expression, was common in pre-modern communities or became dominant as teachers addressed modern global audiences skeptical of hidden kingdoms. The record offers hints in commentaries and sermons, but intentions hide better than palaces. Either way, the inward emphasis has traction because it asks for practice rather than belief. The mountain votes with the pines. You remember the ledger in the lamp hall, the librarian's barometer, the ordinariness that made the sacred plausible. The inner path, if it's going to deserve the name, ought to show up on Tuesdays. That means shorter emails, gentler meetings, a grip that loosens before it breaks. You audit your week and spot 3 places where you can return interest to principle. You mark them like cairns and feel your shoulders drop the way doors do when they finally fit their frames. A dry leaf scuffs across stone, finds a groove, and rests. That seems like a good policy for opinions. Keep the breeze, let the edges soften, settle where usefulness outweighs rightness. In the chest cavity's little city, side streets open. Anger still exists, but now the traffic pattern routes it past the school at a speed that does not frighten anyone. If a gate swings, it does so in both directions. If a guard watches, it watches for moments to be kind. Joke 3. If your heart installs speed bumps, please consider decorative planners. Urban design is a public trust. You try a longer sit. Breath turns from instrument to landscape. Perception swaps drivers without announcing the change. The mind, when it calms, stops selling you futures you didn't order. Behind the eye, a square of light expands and contracts at the speed of patience. You do not reach for it. It has already arrived. You do not name it. The labels would only make it smaller. You notice, and noticing is close enough to prayer to count. Somewhere below, a bell marks a change of shift. Above, the first shy star applies for work and is hired. Your spine requests a neutral policy and receives it. The kingdom you chased across ridges stops running and sits down at the same bench. Within reach, without drama, it sets a small agenda. Keep the flame trimmed, rotate the cups, return the books, reduce harm at the corners. An empire of maintenance governed by the simplest difficult thing, attention that remembers why. When you open your eyes, the world has not changed its furniture, but the room's instructions are clearer. The same trail, the same pack, the same sky wearing its reliable blue. The difference is allocation, less budget for panic, more for curiosity, less for rumor, more for care. On that balance sheet, Shambhala is either a city with perfect zoning or a nervous system that finally quit smoking. Both can call themselves a capital with a straight face. You stand without ceremony. Your knees make a noise that translates to, "Be kind later," and you agree. In the dust at your feet, ant paths weave like careful cursive. They got here first and solved logistics without a committee. You thank them for the tutorial. The inner path turns out to be paved by 1,000 micro-corrections, none of which will trend, all of which will matter to the radius of a room. As you shoulder the pack, the sun tips toward a pass you have not yet used. The trail forward looks like every other trail until you step on it with a different distribution of weight. The rumor of a kingdom does not leave. It relocates to where decisions are made and pretends it has been there all along. You do not argue. You choose stride length, temperature of voice, timing of silence. The gates open from inside, which feels like a security update long overdue. You take 10 steps, count none, and decline to narrate your own progress. The path prefers humility. The pines prefer listeners. The breath prefers to be itself without commentary. You give each what it asks, and in return, they give you a map that does not fold because it has nothing printed on it. You walk anyway, which, in most systems worth trusting, is the only credential that matters. You cross the last shoulder at the hour when colors forget their names. The slope gentles, the wind turns thoughtful, and the ground ahead looks brushed, as if someone tidied it with a wide, careful hand. You do not announce yourself. You do what you learned from lamps in libraries. You arrive by paying attention. A hollow opens, ringed by low hills and pines that seem to lean inward. In the center, frost has polished a sheet of water until it becomes a sky on the ground. Along its edge stand stones placed not by surveyors but by patients. They do not claim to be gates, which is how you know they might be. You walk between them. The air warms half a degree, the way a room does when a friend enters it. On the mirror lake skin, the mountain's reflection arranges itself into terraces and towers, then smears back into cloud. You blink and see a geometry you almost recognize. 4 lines, a circle, a small square breathing at the center. You do not name it. Naming would shrink it. A bell somewhere below hearing taps the hour. Your own pulse answers out of politeness. A mainstream fact crosses the clearing without drama. Far to the southeast, a Chinese county once called Zhongdian officially adopted the name Shangri-La in 2001 to draw visitors, while the Potala Palace in Lhasa, seat of the Dalai Lamas from the 17th century, stands as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a very real testament to Tibetan statecraft and vision. Legends travel, buildings endure, both leave shadows you can step into. You note the distinction, then step lightly anyway. On the far bank, a shape the size of a small house resolves into nothing but light deciding to sit down. Your eyes insist on architecture, your training suggests weather. You laugh once, softly. Joke 1. If customer support ever fields tickets for vision failed to render, they will ask you to restart your expectations. You comply and watch the scene reload, pines, water, sky, a sense of layout that does not need walls. From the trees, voices you met along the way return without faces. The caretaker speaking of kings whose policies were breaths, the lamp tenders measuring clarity with cotton wicks, the librarians who filed storms by pressure, the host who sorted weapons from wisdom and stacked them into recipes. They do not crowd you. They suggest spacing. In the mirror's skin, the terraces return, now filled with people who look like whoever is listening. You let the picture happen the way you let a bird land near your hand. No sudden kindnesses, no demands. A quirky tidbit rides in on curiosity's coattail. Some trekkers swear that near certain high passes their compasses spin or stall as if the needle were weighing more than magnetism. Others swear a blue Himalayan poppy sniffed at dusk delivers a dream of a city you can walk in, though only until first light. Field notes, hearsay, and the stubborn truth that altitude edits judgment place them with the mica glitter manuscripts on the shelf marked unverified, useful to the imagination. You circle the water clockwise, as if the day had become a small mandala meant for feet. At the north quadrant, the world looks slightly brighter, not by color, but by consent. You remember to stand without leaning. The hush becomes a room with good acoustics. Historians still argue whether the royal lists, campaigns, and coordinates braided into Kalachakra lore once encoded real polities in Central Asia, transmuted political anxieties into sacred forecasts, or taught border communities a survival story that outlived its authors. The lake, unhelpful and perfect, provides neither footnote nor objection. Down valley a path splits, then reunites as if to prove that disagreement can be scenic. You test a gate with breath. Nothing opens because nothing is closed. Joke 2. You check your phone's map on principle, and it suggests a detour through inner stability. Estimated time 5 breaths. The interface finally understands its user base. You kneel, break the skin of the mirror, and drink. The cold corrects you like a teacher with kind hands. Behind your eyelids, a city continues to draw itself in lines of patience, markets without shouting, courts that adjourn early because calm has already argued both sides into fairness, kitchens where the password is, "How can I help?" Councils that pause when the room forgets to breathe, and a square where children chalk borders and then erase them before supper. The plans are obvious, the method equally. From the pines, a fox appears and decides you are neither edible nor interesting. Evidently you pass. It vanishes and leaves behind a sound like fabric being folded. You feel taller by a very small amount, the way a chair feels taller when its wobble is repaired. The lake ripples once and shows you a tower again, or a cloud, or a well-timed kindness. The distinction declines to matter. You stand and discover you have nothing to add to the scene, which might be the first useful thing you have learned in years. A short list scrolls in the bright air with bureaucratic clarity. Keep lamps trimmed, return books, pay attention to calendars and the people they carry. Don't confuse thunder for authority. Hold even beauty lightly. Let myth remind you of your posture. Let posture make myth redundant. You nod as if signing for a package. Joke 3. The courier refuses a tip and recommends better shoes. The light thins. Stones hold their vote and keep it secret. A bird crosses the clearing and does not modify policy. The city you do not force begins to fade, less like a vanishing and more like a completed task closing itself. Relief, not loss. This is how some doors work. They teach you how to walk through other doors. You thank the room in the language of steps and pockets emptied of hurry. When you leave the ring of stones, the air cools back to ordinary. A breeze prints pines onto the lake. The mirror returns to water and promises to remember your face about as long as a good joke remembers its first laugh. That is long enough. You climb toward the pass with a cadence that fits an afterimage. You do not look back. What matters has moved closer than your shadow. On the ridge, the first star clocks in. You take the path that was here before. You had reasons and will be hereafter. Far below, a village lights 3 lamps and decides the night is friendly. Somewhere a printer inks a page, a student copies a line, a cook stirs a pot, a judge chooses a gentle verb, a stranger opens a door and finds generosity still working its shift. If a kingdom needs a census, count those moments. If it needs a capital, call it the room you make by how you speak. You walk until the trail agrees to become sleep. The vision does what visions should. It dissolves at the exact rate your responsibility clarifies. You accept the exchange, then you keep walking, which is the only ceremonial gesture that appears in every tradition worth saving. Let the slope flatten in your mind. Let the sky soften a shade, the edges of the peaks rounding like thoughts that know when to rest. Keep your breath slow and unhurried, as if you were counting stars by the sound of their light alone. You are still on the path, but the path has turned into something gentle underfoot, a steady floor that asks almost nothing from your attention except patience. In and out, the lungs learn the old routine again, and with each quiet cycle, the day's sharper outlines blur into kinder lines. Footsteps in snow become footsteps in sand, then footsteps in a room you know well. A lamp waits where you set it. A book closes itself with a soft exhale. A kettle sighs and forgets to boil. Outside, a small breeze thinks about becoming weather and decides to pass. You can let the mind unpack slowly, coat first, then shoes, then the pocket with its careful notes. Those notes are welcome to stay folded. The room has memorized what matters. Any towers still standing in the imagination may settle into the horizon and rest there, part of the furniture now, not a deadline. Any questions still circling can perch for the night and tuck their heads under their wings. You have walked far enough to trust that the rest of the distance will come to meet you while you sleep, that the quiet you have earned will keep its own watch. Let the last of the voices fade to a friendly murmur, the kind that slips behind the walls and becomes warmth. Let your shoulders drop their habits. Let the bed offer its plain, reliable treaty. In a few more breaths, close your eyes, keep the rhythm, and let the kingdom do what all good places do when night arrives, keep you safe and ask for nothing. The end. Sweet dreams.